Are we ready to get started? Great. All right. We're going to get started with our penultimate session of Permafrost Day. To those who have been here or watching online for a chunk of the day, thank you for staying with us. We know it's been a long day. And before we begin, I just want to do some thank yous and shout outs to those who have organized and made today possible. Obviously, ICCI and Pam for this amazing Cryosphere Pavilion. To Rachel Traharn for her incredible organizing and moderating throughout most of the day. To Gustav, who has also been a constant presence, although now I don't know where Gustav has disappeared to. We hope he'll be back in a few minutes to join us. And if I've forgotten others, I apologize. I know this has been quite the group effort, and it's really been wonderful. Round of applause for everybody. I think having this day to really highlight the importance of permafrost within the climate system, the threat that it poses to our global climate targets is really incredibly important. And that's really what this session is going to focus on. And so to kick things off, maybe wake us up a little bit, because for those of us here in Egypt, it's 4 o'clock local time, and some people are on a whole bunch of different times and jet lag. So we're going to do something just a little bit different. We've got about a 1-minute video that we want to play to introduce some of the ideas that we're going to talk about in this session.
Or even the US. But because we don't know for sure which one, permafrost has been left out of the equation.
Can we start at the beginning, please? We're about halfway through here.
Goodwill Climate efforts to improve permafrost cover. Imagine trying to stop climate change without including one of the world's top greenhouse gas emitters. We basically are. Only it isn't a country we've been ignoring. It's permafrost, long frozen ground that covers a vast area and holds twice as much carbon as in the atmosphere. Rapid Arctic warming is thawing permafrost and starting to release that carbon. Depending on how hot we let it get, permafrost thawing emissions this century could be equivalent to continued emissions by Russia, India, or even the US. But because we don't know for sure which one, permafrost has been left out of the equation. It's a disastrous mistake. Goodwill Climate is leading efforts to improve permafrost thaw projections, but we can't wait for all the answers. We have to put permafrost into carbon budgets now. Doing so will make it harder to hit climate targets. Failing to do so will make it impossible.
All right, so just a little teaser of the idea here that actually we're going to take it one step further from permafrost isn't a country to actually thinking about permafrost as potentially the country of permafrost. What would that kind of look like to really integrate permafrost into the UN framework, the COP negotiations that we're in the midst of here and ongoing throughout the years. As it said in the video, and as you've heard if you've been here for some of the events earlier today, permafrost holds a vast amount of carbon, twice what's already in the atmosphere, and that is starting to come out of permafrost as that permafrost warms and thaws. And yet, because of the uncertainty in just how quickly and how much of that carbon will be released, it has been excluded from most climate models, from our carbon budgets, and therefore our policies. And if you think about it as a country, if we were excluding another major country from, say, the US from climate negotiations, we would understand that is a grave omission and threatens the success of any of our targets. We haven't gotten that kind of recognition for permafrost yet, and we really need that. So I'm going to invite, we're going to do this again, end of the day, we're going to do this a little bit differently. I'm going to step away from this microphone. I'm going to invite our 3 panelists to come up here, and we're just going to kind of talk our way through this issue. All right. Okay, I think we're on. Great. So, by the way, I'm Heather Goldstone. I'm Chief Communications Officer at Woodwell Climate Research Center. Really glad to be with you for this panel. We have an amazing panel here to my immediate left. Again, if you've been here for any part of today, you've already encountered Gustav. Gustav Hegelius is a senior lecturer at the Department of Physical Geography at Stockholm University and co-lead of the research unit Landscape, Environment, and Geomatics. He's also the vice director of the Bolin Center of Climate Research. Next to him is Peter Frumhoff. Peter is a senior science policy advisor for Woodwell Climate Research Center prior to joining Woodwell, which was a relatively recent event. Peter served as Director of Science and Policy and Chief Climate Scientist at the Union of Concerned Scientists. And then on the far end, we have Dr. Rachel Traharn, who is a research scientist and Arctic policy lead with Woodwell's Permafrost Pathways project. And she is an ecologist working to integrate abrupt processes and permafrost thaw better into climate models so that we can get it into policy. So I'd like to just start off asking each of you to kind of just ground us in your perspective on this issue of permafrost thaw emissions, their omission from our international climate policy and where we need to go with that. And Gustav, I'll hand it to you first.
Thank you very much. So as you've already mentioned, and as we saw in this movie, we have a situation where the current knowledge we have on permafrost is not fully accounted for in the global carbon budgets. With that said, the latest IPCC report did take a step further than what earlier reports have done and has partly included permafrost in the emission budgets. Unfortunately, it's only roughly half of the emissions that are really accounted for. And when you look at the climate models themselves that were submitted to the IPCC, permafrost is almost completely non-existing in those versions of the climate models. This partly has to do with, I think, just the inertia of the process. And because there are actually, I would say, there are now Earth system models that do a lot better job than what was submitted to the IPCC. But it's also the modeling centers, they have to decide which model version are we going to send to the IPCC. And then because this is a truly global effort, right? They would send the model version that is most stable globally. And the models that tend to do really well in the Arctic are not necessarily stable globally. So they would choose the middle of the road option, the safer option of a more stable, older model version. So I think that this, perhaps we could get around it with having perhaps more emphasis in the process on something like special reports or having separate model into comparison projects happening that could target these individual feedbacks. If we're talking about permafrost in this case or tropical forest feedbacks, there are other examples of crucial processes that are not actually in the IPCC. So perhaps there could be parallel processes of model into comparisons that allow more specialized models to inform so that they don't have to work perfectly across the whole world. And I think that could be a step forward.
Yeah, thanks very much. So I want to kind of respond in a climate policy perspective. But we all know that the Paris Agreement calls on nations to limit emissions well below 2 degrees and strive to limit emissions to 1.5 degrees, and to do so by reducing anthropogenic emissions from sources and enhancing uptake from sinks. But in kind of our policy conceptualization and articulation of what we mean by anthropogenic emissions by sources, we typically focus on direct anthropogenic emissions, right? The emissions that come from the burning of fossil fuels, the manufacturing of cement, the clearing of forests, the degradation of forests and ag soils. And we've established greenhouse gas accounting frameworks for nations to quantify these emissions and report them, albeit they do so quite imperfectly today. And under the Paris Agreement, nations also self-identify through their NDCs what they perceive their responsibilities to be for reducing these emissions and enhancing sinks consistent with the overall climate policy goals that the agreement sets. But largely ignored in this conceptualization are the emissions from thawing permafrost, right? But also emissions from wildfires, and as we've talked about today, and also emissions from wetlands, including tropical wetlands, as you've mentioned also today, that are a major source of methane, in addition to the CO2 and methane coming from permafrost and CO2 from wildfires. that these are unmanaged ecosystems, right? That's the conceptualization, and emissions from them, as the kind of implicit thinking goes, are natural, right? And we even use language that reinforces that wildfires are wild, right? Unmanaged ecosystems are natural, and emissions from them thus are treated as natural as well. But we're in the Anthropocene, and that's just not the case anymore. And our thinking and our policy constructs need to change. The climate change, as we've talked about all day today, is dramatically increasing emissions from permafrost thaw, from fires with impacts on permafrost, including the boreal, and from wetlands. And we're increasingly able to quantify these both today and project them going forward. We might call these emissions collectively knock-on emissions or second-order emissions. They're anthropogenic, right? But they're not directly anthropogenic. They're anthropogenic as a consequence of the warming that we've done. We call this, as we have today, as a positive feedback. I personally hate that phrase. It's a vicious cycle, right? It's not positive in any way in which people tend to think of that phrase. And our assessments of remaining carbon budgets and climate policies don't well account for these emissions. But of course, the emissions exist and they're growing in magnitude, and the atmosphere sees them, even if we don't report them and address them. And that's the important thing, right? The climate is changing as a result of these anthropogenic emissions, but we're not addressing them in our climate policy frameworks today, and that's essential to change. We ignore them at our peril. So how do we think about changing this? I think we start by conversations like today, by elevating them in our shared awareness, by working to ensure that these emissions are included in IPCC and other assessments of remaining carbon budgets, in greenhouse gas accounting and national reporting guidelines, and into accelerated ambition of NDCs and climate action. I'll just say one more piece, which is that this is really tricky terrain in the policy context. The ways in which ecosystems currently get categorized as managed or unmanaged, for example, is a political one, right? It's treated differently by different nations, subject to some gaming, so that what gets listed as an unmanaged ecosystem is really different in Canada than it is in the US, than it is in Russia. And there are really big questions. Who should be on the hook for reducing these emissions, right? Should it be the nation within which the emissions occur? One can make that argument. That's kind of the way in which we typically think of emissions within nations, the nations responsible for them. But after all, emissions from thawing permafrost and other ecosystem sources are the consequence of our cumulative global emissions from all nations. So one could imagine a different construct in which the largest emitters, historic cumulative emitters, are in some ways on the hook for reducing these emissions. We have to figure this out. We're not going to figure it out, though, until we start talking about it. And that's why that's so essential. It's a conversation we need to have. And we need to start, as we are here today, by recognizing that the country of permafrost, right, has growing emissions, has sister countries of wildfires and wetlands that have overlapping jurisdictions, and that real nations that are signatories to the Paris Agreement need to treat these second-order anthropogenic emissions with the seriousness and urgency that the science demands.
Yeah, I'll just very briefly add my own perspective, because I think Gustav and Peter have framed the issue really well. But I think in my head, I kind of conceptualize this as a sort of a dual issue, a sort of two aspects to this. And the first being the kind of sort of the scientific end of the spectrum, which Gustav gave us that context on. This issue that we have that permafrost thaw is not accounted for in climate models. And part of the reason for that, I think it's useful to recognize, is kind of the complexity inherent in the term permafrost thaw. We talk about this like it's one process, but of course it isn't. It's a whole set of processes. And some of those are harder to detect than others. I mean, particularly some people may have been around when we were talking more about abrupt thaw earlier. So this is something that happens at a relatively small spatial scale, but it has significant consequences in terms of carbon release. But it's also something, because it happens at relatively small scales, and we're talking about a really vast region, a really complex variable region, much of which is relatively remote, difficult to access, expensive to work in. finding those things and having a really clear picture of how they're increasing and what the consequences are across the Arctic is just a real challenge. So the scientific challenge there is of course to overcome some of those obstacles, and I think also to make better use of the information that we do have, because of course what we often fall into the trap of doing at the moment is when we don't have that sort of precise quantified certainty, is that we don't sort of communicate the possible implications of these additional processes, these underrepresented processes at all. So we now have this situation where things like abrupt thaw, the implications of fire for permafrost thaw are not well reflected in the carbon budgets, for example, that we have from the IPCC. So then when we consider, okay, so the next step then would be if we could have a full representation of permafrost thaw in carbon budgets, then I think we then move into what in my head is the kind of the second part of this problem, which is what does that mean? What is it that if we do that we're calling for? What is the action? Which is quite difficult because essentially we know that the message there is going to be we are making the mitigation mountain even higher. We're going to be having the message that actually our carbon budget, which we all know is already vanishingly small, is even smaller. So what is it that we want to do about that? And I think the first, perhaps the first step there is, as we all know, it's very difficult to address a problem that we can't name, that we can't really measure. So I think that's when we move into what Peter was talking about, and this fact that not only are these processes and emissions not incorporated in climate models, but we're also not really accounting for these emissions. We don't have a framework for reporting on them. And so I think perhaps a useful thing for us to do and as scientists is perhaps to build kind of collaborations with people who are working more in that space, in the carbon accounting space, and think about how can we change that? How can we bring the country of permafrost into the room at COP and under the UNFCCC?
So, Rachel, I'm going to ask you to keep that microphone for a minute. We've referenced the fact that there's uncertainty in the scope of permafrost thaw emissions, the pace of permafrost thaw emissions, but it's not that we don't know anything. So can you put some bounds on that for us? What do we know? What is that range of, according to our best estimates at this point, what is that possible range of permafrost thaw emissions? What are the ramifications for our carbon budgets? And then let's dig into what some of the sources of that uncertainty are. And Gustav, I'd love to have you weigh in on that as well. But Rachel, go ahead.
Yeah, I think the short answer, and I'm speaking with in mind work that we're doing in our team at the moment, so unpublished work, but the reduction in our carbon budgets would be, I would say, at least 10% up to 40%, maybe even a little bit more than that, particularly when we're talking about the 1.5 degree window. And I think it's important to think not just about the reduction in that budget, but also the overall size of those budgets. Again, particularly when we're talking about 1.5 degrees, we're talking about something that is just a few years of emissions. It's a very small budget, and that means that even a very small change in the proportion of that will be accounted for by permafrost emissions does have a really big impact, because we're really talking about a very small number. So even if we had much lower scientific uncertainty than we do, then that bound of uncertainty still has quite a big impact on the proportion of that budget that we're talking about. And again, I guess that links into what I was saying, is that sort of whether it's 10% or whether it's 40%, we still already have a very small budget left. And what we're saying is that actually this budget is even smaller than we think. So what are we going to do about that?
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, and I think the general ballpark, I would agree that the unaccounted for permafrost emissions would, over longer timescales, take away up to half of the 1.5 degree budget. That is roughly 500 gigatons of CO2 now. And I think that another thing that is really important to keep in mind in this conversation is also the timing of the release from permafrost versus the timing of potential human reductions. And I think there's also a need to focus on how much added permafrost emissions we avoid by choosing a rapid action scenario. So I think you can also, in discussing this and framing this, focus on the fact that the country of permafrost in 2100 looks very, very, very different if we go to rapid emission reductions versus if we go as a business as usual. So if we take this very alarming UNEP gap report that came a few weeks ago, saying that we're on the road to 2.8 degrees global warming. In that scenario, permafrost would roughly equal the US at 2100. But if we stay below 2 degrees, it will equal current EU emissions. If we go to 1.5 degrees, it's less. So I think we also can focus on how much we can avoid and how much we can save with rapid action. And I think that's a really important part of the discussion.
So as Peter already alluded to, this is a circular problem. This is a vicious cycle. But when you take that time component into account, in some ways it becomes even more circular. We come back to this question of, should we be treating the country of permafrost as a cause or an impact, right? Because it's not that we're going to see the emissions, even if we could track them perfectly. It's not that we're going to see the emissions that eat up 10, 20, 40% of the budget in the next 10 years. We're going to see those coming over decades, but we need to be taking that into account now in the actions that we take in the next 1, 2, 5, 10 years, right? So what in your minds does that that difference, I won't say disconnect because they're very connected, but what does that difference in timelines mean in terms of integrating permafrost into a policy framework? Is it the right thing to be integrating it as on kind of a causal side as we do with countries and emitters, or should we be integrating it more as an impact that we need to be looking out for?
Yes. No, we need to do both, right? I mean, it's impossible.
And if you could keep your mic, yeah.
It requires, it's a both and answer. I mean, it's not very satisfying, but even though the emissions from that are committed associated with permafrost within a 1.5 degree world that you showed us earlier won't fully be expressed for decades, we still need, in my view, to take them into account in the context of our conceptualization of what the remaining 1.5 carbon budget is, which currently at current annual emissions will eat up over the course of the next 7 years or so, right? That's the pace that we're on. So, it is. It is a real challenge, and it clearly will require thinking in the long term over pulling carbon out of the atmosphere, right? But it will also require thinking in the near term about increasing our ambition to mitigation. I don't see how you can avoid thinking of it as a both and challenge.
So I'm curious if you mentioned in your opening comments, right? We're talking about permafrost. If permafrost were made a virtual country with its own emissions footprint and its own ability to participate in negotiations, versus permafrost being more akin to the way that we account for, say, deforestation or land use emissions on managed lands, where every country has their emissions from that source. What's the benefit in your mind of making permafrost its own country in a sense, in a policy sense, as opposed to making permafrost a source of emissions that every country with permafrost has to report and take into account in their own participation?
So one of the challenges, I think, with getting countries to...
And the closer you can keep the mic to your mouth.
One of the challenges with countries reporting accurately on their emissions from unmanaged lands, which includes increasingly emissions from permafrost, is that they try to design the system so they maximize the perception that they're getting an uptake from sinks, right? It's really, there's a big gap between what's being reported and what's actually being emitted. And so the incentive for countries to not report emissions from permafrost or from wildfires or from wetlands is very large because it simply increases their national burden as things are currently constructed. One way to think of it, I don't think permafrost is make it the country of permafrost is a good kind of metaphor, but ultimately real nations are the ones who have to agree to reduce emissions. I could imagine, as I alluded to earlier, a construct in which, because these emissions are a consequence of the global cumulative emissions from all nations, that there would be a way of divvying them up that wouldn't have them be solely the responsibility of the nations in which those emissions sit, right? Because they're not directly caused by Canada in the same way that emissions from deforestation or land use change, direct actions, or emissions from fossil fuels would be. That's a conversation that hasn't been engaged because we don't yet recognize the need to have this conversation, right? But I can imagine different ways of addressing this through policy.
Yeah, go ahead, Rachel, if you want to jump in.
Thank you. I just wanted to add to that very briefly because in my head, I feel like one of the reasons that to me that it makes sense to treat permafrost emissions from unmanaged lands, as you say, differently to perhaps deforestation is exactly as Peter was saying. The difference is partly related to the attribution, right? Whose emissions are these? And I sort of instinctively think about that, I guess, partly because I come from the UK, obviously not an Arctic country, but obviously, again, the UK is one of those countries historically produced a lot of cumulative emissions. The idea that the UK shouldn't receive attribution or receive a share of the blame for permafrost emissions is doesn't make any sense to me. So I kind of look at it a bit in that way, just from a personal point of view. And I also just wanted to very briefly touch on something you mentioned earlier, Heather, this idea of permafrost thaw as both a driver and an impact. And it's a little bit of a tangential perspective, but I just felt like it was maybe a good moment to also just sort of emphasize that it is exactly that. Permafrost, I think, is one of those issues that does break down the divide between mitigation and adaptation, right? Because this is something that has very long-term consequences, and it is also a real crisis happening right now, as we've heard sort of throughout the day for communities across the Arctic, particularly indigenous communities living on permafrost systems. This is something that is having, permafrost thaw is already having really catastrophic consequences for those communities. So we have to recognize that, and we have to treat that situation with real urgency and respond to that at the same time as keeping in our heads that this is something that is having also consequences for communities around the world right now and in the future, and it's also going to be something that we have to address 100 years from now. So it's kind of a complex issue in that sense as well.
For sure. So I'm still in this space of trying to figure out what are the alternative mechanisms? How do we change our systems? And I'm going to broaden this to both IPCC and COP to actually make sure that the country of permafrost, that permafrost emissions are somehow taken into account. And maybe let's start with IPCC, because that's where we can actually start to raise the science to another level. IPCC has already recognized that we are underestimating and underrepresenting permafrost in IPCC reports. To any and all of you, do you see, excuse me, in the near term, in the next year, 2, 3, ways that realistically permafrost emissions could be better represented in IPCC science and put onto the COP agenda through that avenue?
Thank you. Yeah, so I think obviously the IPCC cycles move relatively slowly, and we're, I guess, now moving, as soon as the final synthesis report comes, we'll move into cycle 7. But I think that the science is there, the knowledge is there. We know enough to put a relatively good number on this. And I think that, and this doesn't just apply to permafrost, there are a lot of specific Earth system processes that are so complex so that in time we are not going to see climate models that can do all of it and still do it all really well across the globe. So I think I think we do need to allow for still working with global climate models, but having them, tweaked or targeting special processes, or having a northern focused climate model comparison that can inform that feedback, while other model versions will work better in the tropics, and something like the methane emissions from the Sud wetlands that are close to the headwaters of the Nile south of us. They are immense methane emitters, and they also need to be accounted for properly. And I think that having parallel model intercomparison projects that join the models that can do the job and look at specific problems, I think the science is there. But and IPCC already has the mechanism of special reports. So I think special reports focusing these feedbacks, these known unknowns in the global system, could solve it from a scientific point of view, and the knowledge is there and the models are there.
I think there are two different issues with respect to the IPCC. One is getting it incorporated into, getting abruptthra in particular incorporated into modeling and conceptualization and representation in ideally a special report before the next assessment report comes out of the implications for the carbon budget. That's really essential. That's kind of one piece of it. But the other piece of it is that the IPCC creates these inventory guidelines, right, by which nations report what their emissions are. I'm not an expert in this, but my understanding is that was last updated in 2019, and these emissions are not reported. It's not built into the guidelines. So then the question becomes, how do we change that, right? Which is, again, a different question than how do we incorporate it into the conceptualization of the remaining carbon budget. And my understanding is that would require the subsidiary body on science and technological advice, SBSTA, which is meeting here, to call on the IPCC to do this, that the IPCC won't take that on by themselves. I could be wrong about this, but that's kind of my understanding of how change would happen. And for SBSTA to call on the IPCC to do this, that means that one or more nations, one or more parties need to call on SBSTA to call on the IPCC to do this. This needs to be seen as, it's a political choice, right? And so, that creates space for scientists and advocates for science to call on their national representatives to make this a priority. And absent that, I don't think the IPCC is likely to create the kind of reporting framework that requires nations to report their emissions from wetlands, from fire, from permafrost. That needs to happen. That's a separate track, I think, from the question of how to update the carbon budgets accordingly.
I very much agree with everything that's been said already. I guess I would add that I wonder if we additionally need perhaps a little bit of a gentle challenge to the perception that the best available science is solely the IPCC. The IPCC is an immensely valuable thing. But for example, we have to recognize some facts. For example, today, we've already heard talk about very relevant, very important work, which has come out in just the last few weeks, for all of us kind of working in these scientific fields that are really relevant to climate policy. It's really hard to keep up. These are really fast-moving fields. We're seeing new work all the time. The real edge of this knowledge is pushing forward all the time. And that work that we've been discussing today will not be in an IPCC report for a few years. And we are at 1.2 degrees. We are a few years away from beginning to breach the Paris Agreement targets. So really, I'm not sure that just waiting for things, things should be better incorporated into the IPCC. I'm not sure that we can wait for that. So I think also perhaps it's a sort of challenge for the scientific community and others to just really think a little bit more creatively about how do we get scientific knowledge into policy in different ways. How do we make sure that we're doing a better job of really communicating the implications of what we do know? And again, I think also being a little bit more open-minded, a little bit more creative about what the best available science is. We've spoken today about the fact that really we should be seeing indigenous knowledge being better represented in the negotiating rooms. There is a lot of knowledge that communities here at COP have, well beyond the IPCC, and right now I think there is an enormous potential for sharing and using that knowledge in a way that impacts climate policy in a much more effective way than we're doing right now.
All right. So I do want to open this up for audience questions as well. I already see one hand, so I'm going to volunteer my mic for some audience questions.
Thank you very much, Robert Gibson from Hong Kong. Last COP in Glasgow at Earth Information Day, I went into this wonderful virtual booth where a JPL guy was talking to the European Space Agency guy sitting in their respective home, and I was in Hong Kong. And one of the things they said was that by 2025, the satellite observation system will be up to a point where they can measure methane and carbon dioxide, but not nitrous oxide, methane and carbon dioxide emissions by 2-kilometer grid for the planet, more or less real time. Now, if we have that, we're going to know how much methane and carbon dioxide is coming out of the cryosphere. So that, to me, sounds a really important bit of the jigsaw. The second thing is the IPCC's scenarios for staying below 2 degrees all have us having to do some carbon dioxide removal in order to basically get down the overshoot or stop from. Now, the fact that the permafrost country is going to be having emissions, there will need to be carbon dioxide removal to cover that, and somebody's going to have to pay for that. So we need to be thinking about mechanisms for doing that. One possibility is anybody who does a future net emission, in addition to paying for their net emission, they also pay a share of the permafrost country's emission.
Yeah, I can start by commenting on the great advances in satellite remote sensing that are happening. And then you're right, there are satellites that can measure the concentration of methane or CO2 in the atmosphere. The challenge and there are already satellite missions up that are doing this at relatively high resolution. The challenge we have that still is that they see the full column, so they see all of the CO2 or methane in the full atmosphere from the top to the surface, and then we still need to have really good basically weather models to back calculate where on Earth did that come from, because the atmosphere is mixing. It's not as simple as saying that we see the greenhouse gases and then we know where they come from. We still need to back model it, but it's a rapidly developing field, and I think it's really gonna be hopefully a game changer for us in figuring out where emissions come from. So that's a really interesting sort of direction that it's taking. And I think that, you're also right in any trajectory that takes us to 1.5 degree, you need to see cut in half of emissions by 2030, net zero roughly 2050, and then sustain negative emissions going into the future. And if we, in a theoretical world where we do that, we're then going to have to add on to those negative emissions quite substantially to offset the permafrost damage that we've already done and that we will do leading up to that. And someone would need to pay for that. And I imagine you were already talking about ways of perhaps attributing the country of permafrost based on historical cumulative emissions, which would, I guess, be one relatively sensible way of doing that. But I guess I'll leave that more up to you to comment on.
I'll let you know where we get. Okay.
I guess the only brief thing I'd add is it's that piece of the puzzle thing. If in a world where we could sort of have a complete monitoring picture of emissions as the atmosphere is seeing them, we still need to connect that with what is being reported and is being kind of integrated in the conversations happening in the IPCC, in whether that's sort of assessing progress towards the Paris Agreement goals. We still need those different frameworks to talk to each other.
Can I ask a follow-up question? And I know that at the highest level, the answer is yes, but I'm still going to ask you to kind of prioritize a little bit. You're talking about the ability to essentially monitor in real time emissions. But we've already talked about the time dimension to this issue, that it's not necessarily the permafrost emissions that happen in 2022 or 2025 that are the real threat. It's the fact that they're going to escalate and they're going to be even more in 20, 50, 80 years, right? So which is more important and how are they linked? Is it the real-time monitoring or is it the ability to accurately project what we're likely to see decades down the road in terms of permafrost emissions that's actually most important in terms of understanding the threat that we face?
Maybe just to be difficult, I might say neither. If we're going to try and come up with the most important things, I think the most important thing with permafrost is, of course, the impacts happening on the ground right now, and perhaps the second most important thing is maybe slightly different to being able to really precisely project future emissions of permafrost. Maybe the most important thing is, again, utilizing the knowledge that we have and elevating sort of awareness of that and encouraging responses to that. And in parallel to that, also trying to narrow the bounds of that uncertainty and make those estimates more precise. But I think we can't wait to do that before we try and encourage a response to it.
So I'm also going to answer the question by not answering the question, which is to say, I think from a mitigation perspective, this is very different from the issues associated with loss and damage and adaptation, which are central to dealing with the implications of permafrost thaw. But from a mitigation, from a country of permafrost mitigation perspective, from my point of view, by far the most important thing we need to do is decarbonize our energy economy, right? That the more quickly we can reduce the vast amount of emissions that come, in addition to slowing deforestation, all the things associated with land use. I don't mean to put that aside as secondary, but unless we're accelerating at the fastest pace possible our ability to decarbonize our energy economy, the country of permafrost is only going to keep growing, right? And whether those emissions are near term or long term, their ultimate implications from a intergenerational justice perspective are enormous. So it behooves us to draw upon the information associated with the current and future emissions associated with permafrost, to use that as yet another essential driver of increased ambition associated with decarbonizing our energy economy, to getting off of emissions from the burning of fossil fuels. That's always job one. I just want to not leave that off the table.
Okay, so I'll try to answer your question from sort of wearing my scientist hat and not thinking about emissions for a short while. And then I think that actually there's some really exciting possibilities of using this emergent real-time data to develop the models that let us project into the future. So we can't really decouple them. The only way we're going to make the models projections better are by improving the process representation of what's happening today. And this new satellite missions are giving us really, really strong tools for putting the right processes into the models and then having them project into the future. So I think the improvement of understanding the spatial patterns of today is what's really allowing us to project into the future in a better way down the line.
Are there other questions from the audience? Okay.
Thank you. I'm Tyrone Dunbar from the UK Met Office. So as we're getting closer to the 1.5 degrees of global warming, there's a lot of discussion about overshoot scenarios. And I was just wondering, has there been any work done looking at what happens to permafrost in an overshoot scenario? Should we, maybe hard to imagine, but reach a position where we start reducing global temperatures? Does the permafrost still continue emitting greenhouse gases?
Okay, so Gustav, you actually showed a graph of this earlier today. So I'll hand it to you first, and then if others want to jump in.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, so there has been some somewhere. I mean, there are no models that have the coupled processes represented well enough to really get the full dynamics of recovery with high precision. But still, there have been studies indicating that overshoot of 1 degree above 1.5 degrees would roughly double the permafrost emissions by 2100, and there's really strong evidence that the thaw that happens while you're in an overshoot world where it's warmer is basically irreversible for several centuries, because when you lose the ground ice, when you lose these fundamental processes, they don't recover. At least it takes centuries before they recover. So it has a really strong impact.
I just wanted to say that from a policy response perspective, overshoots imply either carbon dioxide removal, right, at scale, at dramatically increased scale, or for some people, it also means entertaining ideas about reflecting, albedo reflection, right, which sort of gets into this conversation about solar geoengineering, for which there are people that are wrestling with this in a variety of different ways. The U.S. government will be coming out with a research plan on solar geoengineering research at the end of this year. So I think it's likely, I don't want to over prognosticate, that the increased awareness of the implications of permafrost thaw for overshooting highly desirable temperature targets will drive increased attention to and conversation about albedo modification technologies and approaches. Whether we as a society should go down those approaches or not is a whole other conversation, right? But there needs to be, in my view, a kind of really important dimension of those conversations, which is I would call a procedural justice one, which is that the communities in Alaska, elsewhere in the Arctic, are being most affected by permafrost thaw in terms of impacts, need to have a seat at whatever table gets constructed about dialogues around those kinds of climate responses. They currently don't have one, right? That conversation is taking place in the scientific community, in some policy settings, but not in an inclusive way. So to the extent that permafrost thaw drives those conversations, my own sense is it probably will. It's really important that communities who have the highest stake in decisions about that are really seriously engaged in those conversations.
We had a question in the back. I'm going to come around. Are you going to come up? Great. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm from the Pacific Island. I don't know why I'm sitting here, but I'm so concerned. I'm so concerned. As you talked about your Arctic, the glaciers melting, I am a concerned person because it all end up in me. So what is it to me? Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's everything to you, right? Thank you. I don't know what else to say.
Yeah, I've actually been, as I've been listening, thinking, you know, um, as critically important as it is that we have Arctic communities at the table to represent these issues. We actually did a side event earlier this week with a group called Arctic Angels Global Choices, which are global South activists advocating for more attention to the Arctic in recognition that what happens in the Arctic influences our entire climate. And it's the global South and it's small island developing states that feel the impacts of that warming first and most. And I would say it's quite possible that it's countries like yours that could be some of the strongest advocates for policy to address permafrost thaw simply because of that, right? This is one more impact that one more impact of climate change that your country is going to feel first and most, but did not actually cause. So yeah, I think there's huge room for global alliance and for global South countries to play a huge role in trying to address this issue. It is not an Arctic alone issue, right? So thank you for that, and thank you for being here.
Thank you. I thank the presenters. My name is Adam Ole Mwarabu from Tanzania. I've seen our mountain being one of the mountains losing the ice in East Africa, including Ruwenzori in Kenya. And I think we're experiencing severe droughts. And I think, according to my culture, it is because of loss of ice. But I didn't see the drought being related to the loss of ice on our mountains. But according to our prophecies, we have seen that this is one of the indicators of losing ice. We are mobilizing ourselves to find a way of restoring the landscapes of Kilimanjaro ecosystem, and maybe in the future we will learn a lot on restoration, but still a challenge of how to harmonize our work between two countries. But the situation is severe, and I think this should be seen on these reports. But another thing is we are in the middle of modern science and our elders' prophecies that it will come a time. And for you, we have seen you projecting 2050, 2060, and 20 something. I think most of these reports also should not be shared with a certain age because it creates psychological problems among the young people, especially the children. And I don't know how this can be, how much this report should be disclosed because it creates fears to some people. So this is an issue of ethical area of it. So my concern now and my question is, how are we going to make these reports implementable in terms of language, but in terms of a framework? Thank you.
I just want to respond maybe initially on the point you were making about the well-being of young people, because I think it's a really important one, and I think it's one that I'm sure like so many of us wrestle with. And I think it is true, right, that it is really it's heavy, a lot of the discussions that we have, and I'm conscious that for a lot of the young people and others who are disproportionately affected by climate change here at COP, it's intense, and how we support people in dealing with that, I don't know the answer, but it's a really important question. I think I also just want to recognize that, for example, like earlier today, we had a session focusing on intergenerational justice, and speaking in that event to youth representatives who, of course, are hugely well informed about all of the issues we're discussing, but also really powerful advocates and doing really powerful work, whether in their own communities or elsewhere. And I don't know, but I wonder if that is one way of having a path to action, and it is in a way an outlet for some of that difficulty and some of the heaviness of these issues, is something that perhaps I think the younger generation has utilized really powerfully. Is that one way to sort of respond to that and cope with it is to take action. And I wonder if that is related to what we've seen in the younger generation, which is this incredible groundswell of action and activism and creative solutions and incredible collaboration and network building across youth, young people from different communities. So just one response to your points.
So as a communications person, I'll also jump in here and just say I don't know the right answer on exactly how early and how to talk about where we are and where we're headed with our children, but also as a mother. I know that, as you said, whether or not we choose to share the information with our children, they will get the information. They already have it. And to me, trying to withhold it feels like one more betrayal on top of the betrayal of our intergenerational duties that got us to where we are today. So I don't know what the best way is to do it, but I feel like withholding information is not what we can do with our children and the coming generations. We have to find, as Rachel said, the way to impart the information and empower the next generations, coming generations, to both cope with that mentally and to confront it in our societies. So we are 1 minute shy of our allotted time. That feels like a pretty good place to end, but if there are final thoughts from any of our panelists, I would like to offer the microphone for those. No. All right. Well, thank you all for joining us. We do have one last session today, and that is that at 6 o'clock, a special session that will be a viewing of a short documentary about an Arctic community that needs to relocate, and a brief response from a colleague of ours who works closely with those communities. So a special on the shorter side session at 6 o'clock as our final for Permafrost Day. So we hope you'll join us for that. And thank you to all of you for being here and everyone online for joining us.